Welcome to episode 8 of Talking Point on WISP Sports Radio, where we delve more deeply into the systemic barriers facing women in sport. I'm your host, Lisa Ingarfield, and Talking Point is co-produced by myself and WISP Sports. At WISP Sports, we believe women in sport deserve equal coverage. Last month, in episode 7, we talked to Dr. Nikki Brown about her research into the effects of breast development and breast pain on girls' and women's participation in sport. This month, we're extremely lucky to be joined by Karen Lofstrom, who for 30 years has advocated for women and girls in sport in Canada and internationally. We will hear about the trends Karen has seen, changes and improvements, but also where she thinks we still need to go. For more than 30 years, Karen Lofstrom has been an active participant, volunteer, leader, mentor, and advocate for girls and women in sport and physical activity, both in Canada and internationally. After stepping down from her role as the executive director of the Canadian Association for the Advancement of Women and Sport and Physical Activity, she has continued to stay engaged in sport as a consultant. Karen's commitment to achieving gender equity in the Canadian sports system is shared through her collaborative approach. She works with organizations to develop gender equity initiatives focusing on getting more girls and women engaged as participants and leaders. From physical activity to high-performance sport, participation to women as board members, professional staff, and coaching positions. Karen also provides expertise working with organizations that want to create a more inclusive, safe, welcoming environment for all girls and women, including the LGBT community, Aboriginal, ethnic minorities, and newcomers. Welcome, Karen, to this month's episode of Talking Point. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Great, thanks for the invitation.
So I'm excited to talk to you because you have a long history of working on equity issues, gender equity issues for women and girls in sport. But I wanted to begin by hearing a little bit more about this new initiative that the Canadian government just announced, if I understand it correctly. In their most recent budget plans, they committed $30 million over the next 3 years to support girls and women in sport. And it sounds like you are right in the middle of this amazing opportunity. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about that with our listeners.
Sure. Yeah, I think it was quite a shock to all of us that have been for many years working in this area with limited funds to have this government that's been in office for 3 years, but to come forward with this huge announcement. And as a surprise to all of us, it wasn't like, I don't think we would even have asked for that much money. So it's a great opportunity. So the minister, Kirsty Duncan, is putting together a working group for gender equity in sport to actually figure out about ideas for spending this money. So luckily, I've been invited to be in part of this working group. And they're looking at, we haven't had our first meeting yet, but in their kind of terms of reference or the information that they're looking at putting out to the public, they're talking about programming specifics for girls and women, addressing gender-based violence and sexual harassment in sport, and increased representation of women in sport and leadership positions. So it's very exciting to have actually a minister and government that is supporting gender equity and putting the resources behind it to actually, keep our fingers crossed that implementation and the money actually flows for the next 3 years and hopefully farther than that. But huge positive steps.
What do you think the impetus was for this decision? I mean, it sounds like from what you're saying is that maybe the talk has been there for some time, but not the resources. And now this decision to put money to the initiative that has not previously been a priority.
Well, we had a change of government 3 years ago, and this government under Justin Trudeau, Pierre was his father, who was also a former prime minister, they have a big equity focus. When they came out with their cabinet, it was 50-50 men and women. And so they are trying to push gender equity in all areas of their work and also in their international platform. But so I think, we have been pushing for many years to have, more attention paid on gender equity in sport. But I think some of the staffers for the minister, and we've actually had a change of minister too. So the current one, I think, kind of almost got the byproduct because the budget was already there, but she's a huge supporter. So it was like perfect timing. But I think it was just they were wanting to dig deeper in gender equity in all different departments and all the policy areas that the government affects. So luckily for us, women in sport was an area that hadn't had much attention before, and now we'll get some.
Yeah, that's really great. And for you, having worked in the field for such a long time, it must feel like just a long time coming, right? You've been advocating for this for over 30 years. And finally in 2018, or probably 2019 is when the money will start to come through. That a sense of relief that people are actually listening.
Yeah, I mean, there was a few of us that were, a couple of the women that were the founding mothers of CAUSE, which was the organization I worked with for quite a few years, the Canadian Association for the Advancement of Women in Sport and Physical Activity. And like, one of the gals, like Marianne Lay, she said, I didn't think I'd see this in my lifetime, right? To have this kind of resources put behind it. I mean, you never know if people are actually listening or who's listening to you, because we've been talking about these issues for a long time. But I guess when it falls on the right ears and with the right climate in the country and, have an interest in gender equity, the kind of the stars aligned or whatever. So it's so exciting. I mean, everyone was literally shocked. Like we were like, how did this happen? But obviously, Canada has been, over the years, a leader in women in sport. But I would have said lately, in the last 8 years, we hadn't been resourced to keep out in front. We weren't being as innovative or creative or making new steps. We had started earlier, but I'd say we kind of plateaued. So it's good to have this, next level of Kickstarter funding to be pushing and innovating and, and hopefully setting the bar high for others to follow as well around the world.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, given your perspective that you've been doing this work for so long in Canada and internationally, what are some of the big changes that you've seen, albeit I realize many of those changes might have been slow to materialize, but over the last 30 years regarding women and girls in sport, like what are some of the big things that you've seen, positive changes in Canada and beyond?
Well, I think there has been an increase of opportunity for girls to play sport, and not just the, swimming, gymnastics, which is great. They're great sports, but having opportunity for girls to have choice. That piece that they can, if they want to play football, they want to box, whatever it is, like that, there is an opportunity. I think, in Canada, I think US and probably around the world, there's still an physical activity crisis. Like there are not enough kids being active. So in some cases, I often say that, girls, it's the active girls getting more opportunity to play more different sports. We haven't got more, as many different girls playing, right? But that kind of piece for sure, I always kind of, that change of getting opportunities for girls to play sports and fighting for those chances, similar, I think, Title IX and stuff in the States, that piece might have been the easy step. It wasn't easy, but the idea, if general public parents drive around, they see kids, girls and boys playing, whatever sport, soccer, football, softball. But do they notice, like, who's officiating? Who's coaching the team? Who are the club officials? That next level is the harder one to get to, I think. There isn't as many, women that are in those roles. So, the first steps of getting more opportunities is great. The next steps are more subtle, and it's not as easy to, for the reasons why they aren't being able to be participating. We do in Canada with the sport administration, the National Sport Organization systems, we saw a push, in probably the mid 80s to get more women in kind of entry-level sport admin jobs, to get women in the system. And, that was positive, and there's lots of women in the entry level. And I think we also had success in, getting women in managers, in the executive director or the CEO. Not huge numbers, not half of them, but in quite a few sports. But the other gap still is in the high performance director or technical director areas. So hardly any women in those areas. But, that also speaks to the issue of not a lot of women coaches, because often those high performance or technical roles, those people come from a coaching background. So if we don't have a lot of, high performance women coaches, then we're also not having them as technical directors down the road. But I mean, I think, there's the push is slow. I mean, we're seeing when there's attention paid, from organizations to try and get, let's say it's more women on their boards, when they have a nominating committee that has women involved, and are, reaching different networks of people to recruit people to serve on boards, then we're seeing, some positive change in, percentages of women on boards. But it isn't something you can take your foot off the gas. If the next year you don't do it, well, the numbers go back. We haven't kind of got over that hump where this is the norm. It's still taking work, right? So definitely, for me, that's a huge area where I think we can have greater influence in how sport is run, is by having the leadership be more equal, more diverse.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you have a diverse leadership group, then they're setting the policies, they're setting the tone, they're also role modeling for folks who are coming up through that particular sport or business, right? And so individuals are seeing leaders who look like them in those leadership positions, and that's very meaningful for women, for folks of color, for people with disabilities who are largely excluded from some of these leadership positions, and still to this day. And I really liked your point about having to keep your foot on the gas, right? It's not just as simple as, okay, this year we have a gender equitable board for this particular organization and they're all serving a 2-year term, right? Great. But in 2 years, we kind of like roll back to how we were before. As though it's this, there's like a finishing line that you need to cross. And if you cross it once, then you're good. I think that mentality still perhaps permeates the world of sport. And I'm wondering if you could speak to beyond numbers, right? So beyond getting women into leadership positions, getting women onto boards, getting more women coaches in high profile sports or high profile positions, like what are some of the barriers that you've seen for women once they get there? That they don't stay, right? We did talk with Shannon Miller a couple of episodes ago. So we learned about her experience coaching hockey. And I'm sure, or I'm absolutely positive, her experience is not unique, right? So what are some of the things that you've seen around the way women are treated in those positions?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think the environment that women come into can often be hostile. I think it is really, like you talked about, the leadership and the role modeling and showing what we want it to be. Because women's voices aren't heard around the board table. They're always put in the secretary role, taking the minutes, asking to get coffee. Like, they'll raise a point and it'll be ignored. And then, 2 men later will say the same thing. And, then, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Hopefully, I think what I have found with an organization that have better board governance really makes a difference in kind of the experience of women coming in. How are they looking at the board members that come to the table? Are they wanting to have a cross section? Like we've been starting using it here in Canada, a lot of the organizations, a skill matrix. So all the different board members have to fill in what is their background and skills, both in the real technical skills, like, if they're accountant, lawyer, those types of things, and people skills, their communication, their networking, their, fundraising, all these other pieces. So that you're not looking always so much on the gender as you're recruiting people with these skill sets. Some may be women, some may be men, maybe person of color, disability, whatever. But that you're having a cross section of people that it's just not your buddies. Asking, and we joke about the old boys club that you're having, it's not just that. Also, when the people come into the board, there is an orientation, and sometimes I've seen, I kind of joke that the person that's, sometimes the most, you would think the one that's going to cause problems, they're put in charge of the buddy system of orienting the new person. After they had the formal orientation, but, checking in on meetings and do they understand, all the ins and outs and of backgrounds on different things, to rather than being the critical one, to be the one that's given, as if, they're got a special job to help, sometimes takes off the edge of them being critical of the person. For sure, I've seen boards that have term limits, so you can't stay on forever, right? If it's 2 years or 4 year terms, it's 6 years is 8 years. There's a maximum, because if there's never any turnover, then it's hard to get new people in the boards, and it's often harder for women to have to run against the guy that's been there for 8 years, or 10 years. It's easier to potentially have an opportunity to fill space when someone has left, rather than have to defeat someone. Not that they're definitely able to defeat people, but not having those turnovers in your processes, I think really has helped in some boards get openings to have, not only women, but all kinds of diversity in the mix. But for sure, there's talk around the threshold point being 3 and 10 to really make a difference of women's ability to feel comfortable, to contribute, to be valued. When you're there by yourself, like, that's just not a fun place to be, right? If it's too, it's going in the right direction, but they say in the research that over 3 on McKinley pieces, that really makes a difference, and there's opportunity for positive change and such. It is in the board setting, or on committees, or working even in an organization with not many women, is definitely needing to have thick skin. And I often joke, women sometimes, there are issues of confidence and such, and there's research out there around, applying for jobs. Usually a job description or a skills piece is like a shopping list. That's, that'll be the perfect candidate. But as a person hiring someone, you're not really expecting everyone to have, all those 10 characteristics. But if men can do 2 or 3 of them, they'll put their name in. Women have to do like 8 or have that before they even put their name in. So we're a little hard on ourselves. But the comment around fake it till you make it. I think, we definitely need to put ourselves out there and take on those challenges, because if they're not coming to us. You're not usually, so often are the women asked to be in, which is another piece for sure in both in applications for board positions or coaching. Asking women, because women are shy. If you see a poster on the wall of recruiting board members, you're not usually going to run over and try to reply. But if someone says, I think you'd make a good board member, that is like they're giving you the confidence to do it. I think hopefully the setting of a really uncomfortable board table. I guess I shouldn't say it. It isn't going away, and we see that in the case of Shannon, and we've seen it in Shannon Miller and lots of other coaches, unfortunately, that the really derogatory and negativity and not valuing women's sport like they value men's, is we haven't gotten over that kind of piece. Even in I'd say areas where there's been great success in the women's teams, more than men's, it's still, then there's a jealousy. Like, it can't just be a positive reward. It's great you're doing, we hope we do well too. It is, for sure, sport is one of the last kind of bastions of this really unbalanced, threat of women doing well. But it's definitely frustrating.
Yeah, it is, just listening to you talk about all the ways that it's frustrating. And I think that's something that we need to constantly be aware of, that it's not just one thing, right? That there's self-confidence in young girls that they can play sport and they should be encouraged to play sport, and then women in leadership roles and mentorship and coaching, and women being encouraged or feeling encouraged to participate in higher levels, whatever that looks like. And so there's a crisscrossing or intersecting network of all these issues that are working in concert with each other, that continue to maintain kind of at a systems level this disparity between genders. And it can sometimes feel a little overwhelming, I think, to know, well, how exactly do I start to chip into this monster, right? So You mentioned your organization cause that you had helped establish. What were some of the things that you did in that organization to try and chip away at this kind of this monster of competing or connecting issues?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some overarching kind of pieces that affect both the participant athlete side as well as the leader. And one of the pieces was created a resource around the psychosocial factors of girls' engagement in sport. And I think, and it's not only as the athlete, but as the leader, because I think for sure, understanding that women, not all women, some generalizations here, but think a bit different, right? That social connection, that feeling of being valued is really important for kind of the next steps of, effort and success, right? And performance, where, feeling that, you belong in women and young girls for sure. Like you were talking about, the dropout rates and wanting to if we can keep girls in sport and physical activity long enough so they reap the benefits of this confidence development, it really helps them later, if they want to take on volunteer or board roles or sport admin or coaching. But having male coaches, because often female coaches have the lived experience, so they understand this just innately. But for men to understand that, having that conversation, I was talking with one of the former national soccer coaches in Canada, and he was talking about how he finally learned that if he brought the athletes, when they came to practice, for the first 5 minutes, he'd let them run around the track, warming up, talking to each other, and then they would come and sit and listen to him say what they were going to do at practice. But if he wanted to talk to them right away, he could never get their attention. And it was just some basic, like at any age, young women, that social connection is so important. So having them feel that that's valued and that's will help girls and women stay longer. I mean, I think we also talked a lot about in this kind of psychosocial factors is around the on and off ramps of young women and girls in their life of in school, getting out of sport and having opportunities to come back in, going to university, how we don't have as many of the people with sport experience, wanting to take on the coaching roles or board positions, because we lose them, after their university experience because they're working in family and potentially those types of things. How do we keep track of them so that we have this wealth of knowledge of, female athletes that we could be using later, right? To keep keep connected to them, those types of things. One more recent piece that was work was created around a female coach mentorship program. And there had been quite a few different types of mentorship programs happening in Canada. But this time, a big part of the focus was on educating the mentor. Because we'd often have, a coach gets hired. Oh, and okay, by the way, will you mentor this up and coming, younger coach? And, they're not really given the opportunity to say no, that they have to do it. And they may not have had much experience in, what's the best way to do that kind of stuff. So having the opportunity to actually train mentors in advance of them working with their mentees really was a positive piece. And this material that was created, a resource for mentors, mentees, and for sport organizations that want to look at developing more female coaches. It's all available online at cause.ca and coach.ca. It was in partnership with the Coaching Association of Canada. It's a great resource and all kinds of different tools for planning and 360-degree evaluations. So small clubs, if they want to do part of it, there's tools that they can take their news. And it was great because it was two of the lead mentors were Mel Davidson, who was an Olympic hockey coach for Canada and worked with the Canadian Hockey Association or Hockey Canada, and Alison McNeil, who coached our women's basketball team in the London Olympics. So both with lots of experience in coaching and developing more coaches. So very positive. Interesting enough, we talked earlier about how female leadership, changes the decisions that get made. When we were looking for some pilot organizations to work on this, the ones that stepped up were wrestling, basketball, tennis, and hockey. And the first three all have CEOs that were women. And then Mel Davidson is the the director for the women's program at hockey. So we didn't go out looking for women CEOs to ask to be in the program. They just, came to thinking this was important. So, just by having that leadership, they said, yes, we should, they had to have staff that were involved in the program. But it was interesting to see, kind of only halfway through the program did we realize that, we've ended up with, sports that were led by women. But those things are very positive on that end of it. And another resource that was created, and these are all, like I said, available. The resources that we create have been funded by the government, so they're available for free on the websites. I still say we, even though I've been gone about a year and a half, but was around women on board resources, and they're just webinars, and they're you can listen to them online. Or you could, in Canada, you could have actually your association, you could ask to have done for your staff or your volunteers. But one, looking at the women themselves and what kind of skill development do they need and confidence building and developing their own personal leadership plan to actually have a plan on how you want to work your way and develop things you need to do to actually get on a board. And another one that is actually for the boards. So boards that have are looking at this, either that some that need to be convinced that they should be doing this, or others that are keen to do it, but then they need help with, what are the recruiting strategies and how do we actually go about this and bylaw changes and what you need to do to actually make this happen in your association. So it's been very positive. And I think hopefully given this new money from the government, there'll be more pushing in this direction to actually have these kind of changes happen. And, from my end, I'll be pushing for, having policies set around these areas, because I know, right now we have a government that's interested and willing to put resources in, but they probably, as we know, governments change. But so if policies are a legacy from this, then after, if the government changes or their direction changes, those pieces will still be in place. I mean, this needs to happen at the sport level too. If your sport is governed and has policies in place, because of a keen leader at the time, but when they go, you still want to have that legacy continue of, all the positive steps for gender equity that can be taking place. So having that kind of piece for me will be, this is something I've always been pushing for, to have, that outlast the person that's leading the program at the time.
Yeah, and I think policy changes or legal changes are really important, and it's one step, right? Because I think about Title IX here in the United States, and that was initiated in 1972, prohibiting sex discrimination in educational institutions. And obviously a big effect of that was in college sports, and it's broader than that, but that's where a lot of people kind of think that Title IX centers. But we still, in 2018, over 40 years later, are struggling around gender equity broadly in education, but that sex discrimination and sexual abuse within the context of sport that's happening, right? So the law and the policy is important, but it kind of comes back to that climate issue that you had talked about before, we can put 15 different policies in place, but if you don't have people in the leadership positions that buy into those policies and are committed to shifting a culture and actually proactively working to change the narrative, then kind of substantively nothing really changes.
Absolutely right. And we've had a couple of good examples this past year where we've having conversations about this type of thing, and had Bruce Robinson, who is the CEO of Freestyle Skiing Canada, stood up at the Canadian Olympic Committee meeting and said, I want to have 50-50 on my board. I'm looking for more women. Let me know if you're interested or if you know anybody. So he made in front of all the CEOs of all the sports. He said this, right? So those kind of things, leading by example. I mean, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen Rugby Canada has changed their policies to be at least a 40-60 split, either men or women, in their boards. Similar, some diversity rules around in Golf Canada. I mean, for sure, I think that, the culture is changing, and hopefully we will see, that I always find in sport, I'm sure it's the same in the US and other parts of the world. In Canada, they're competitive, right? So if one sport makes a change and it actually helps, then, and they talk about it, then others, oh, well, maybe I better try that too. It could have been in high performance techniques or whatever, but, if they're having success some way. There was an example at the London 2012 Olympics, Sebastian Coe, who was the leader of the organizing committee. He said he wanted to have equal men and women on staff of the organizing committee, including the managers in all the sport technical areas. And when they would be hiring people and they would come to him with a list of, potential applicants, and there would be no women, he'd send the selection committee back and say, there is women out there. You're not doing a good enough job looking for them. So again, leadership driven. And they ended up in the games having that equal staff. But it has to be, it isn't the easy way, for sure. It has to be, having that broader reach. One of the things also in Canada, the law changed around our not-for-profit acts, which all our national organizations are not-for-profit corporations, and we used to have one person for a representation for every province or territory often was who was on the board. So you couldn't, the province would vote, and that's who you'd get on your board. Where now it's you can't come in representing anyone specifically. You have to be coming from at large. But that's opened the door to have, trying to find more people that have corporate backgrounds and, different other kind of entities, and working with other people that have backgrounds in being a corporate director and seeing if they're interested in working in a sport environment as well. Because often people have played sport maybe at the university level, or, they didn't go to the national team stream. They all went off to be a, CEO of some corporation, and then they can bring these skills back. So it's really been interesting to see having, and they're used to, their board meetings and their structure of organizations being very quite professional. So the kind of, we're bringing up the standard, hopefully, of governance, and having, looking at pieces. We had an incident, with harassment and such in our Olympic committee. And then that made, I would say, every sport organization look at their harassment policies. Hopefully they've taken them off the shelf, dusted them off, and are reviewing them to make sure they actually, are being implemented. But I think sometimes we need, the wake-up call that, talking about factors that keep women out, that harassment, and, innuendos and, the chilly climate that's sometimes, drives women away, that it's everyone's responsibility, men and women, to talk about that. And it's not fair game anymore to say, oh, he's just like that, or, oh, he doesn't mean it. But we need our male colleagues to as well call out each other, on inappropriate behaviors and things that shouldn't be happening. I think that piece of having, more male voices, I think, in the discussion, it's too bad that it is by women's voices, things aren't changing, but we're seeing that it's not, right? So we do need more male colleagues and, that are willing to think this is the right way to go and be talking about, what they can do in their reaches. Sometimes it's based on, I've seen, them having daughters, or sisters or those type of things, but that they kind of have this aha moment that, oh, like they're not getting the same opportunities, or they're treated badly, or, that they will help in the push to have things more equitable.
Yeah. And I struggle with that a little bit. Like, I think it's great, right? So if that's the motivation, if that's the impetus for you to have the aha moment that you have a daughter or a sister, and you make, and, in the process of being with them and observing their interactions, you have this moment, but then it shouldn't take that, right? It should, it should be like self-evident that there is this discrepancy. And I think, years and years and years ago, I went through I helped facilitate a multicultural retreat. And my co-facilitator said this phrase that I've never forgotten. And he said, smell the air even when it doesn't smell for you. And I just thought that was brilliant, right? So I think with men in sport, men in leadership positions in particular in the sports industry need to smell the air even though it doesn't smell for them, right? So their experience of being a leader in the sports industry is very different from what it would be for a woman. Or I should probably be more specific, and likely white men in the sports industry, their experience is very different from women, from men of color, from women of color, from folks who have disabilities, right? But they need to have some awareness or some capacity for reflection that their day-to-day is not replicated through every other person, right? And I think that gets lost or is missing or isn't taught, or I'm not sure what happens and why many men in particular can't make that kind of empathetic leap.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, in this process with this new resources coming forward, I mean, I think that's a lot of the capacity needs to be built to understand, because they often, I don't know if it's like they don't see it. They don't see that, that, I mean, they've existed one way of, oh, we need a new person on our board. Okay, I'll get one of my golfing buddies or my whatever, right, to come, rather than the processes of there's, the best decision, learning from the corporate world, the best decisions are made when it's a diverse group of not all thinking the same, on the different ideas, but to have them educated to raise this awareness that, of all those, the different areas. I think when I've seen in some of the workshops I've done, around the psychosocial stuff with the coaching girls, just watching the male coaches that coach the teenage girls when there's something to help, like they're already keen to help, but they don't know what to do. Like they don't know how to change their coaching styles. When they get this information, they're like sponges. They just love it, right? Because it makes them a better coach and they'll have more success. But not all coaches care that much, right? I mean, they might be caring about performance, but they're not. There's another layer left there, with girls and women on, keeping them engaged in all those kind of other factors that are going on, especially in those younger ages. But definitely to have that awareness raised that they need to think differently. Maybe they need education on different things. I mean, and there's women too that are, that also could use education. It's not only men, but to do things differently, to be, having women get opportunities, if it's in coaching, if it's, in hiring processes, board recruitment, all those types of pieces that, that we have to open the door wider to get more people in the mix. I almost need is it the Rooney Rule for African American coaches in professional sports? We need something like that for the women's hiring and coaches, to have it in the mix.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about race and how that also intersects with this conversation, because it's not just about gender, right? So when we think about bringing more women into sports, whether that's the playing of sports or the leadership of sports, we have to be cognizant and thoughtful that it's not just white women, because I definitely see that in the United States, that there is, when we talk about gender equity, it ends up being unintentionally, but again, because those systems of privilege are at work, that it ends up being white women. And I'm wondering what that's like in Canada, what differences that you've seen in terms of participation rates, leadership rates, if you look at race and gender together.
Yeah, for sure. Would be underrepresented even more, on Aboriginal girls and women. Same thing, newcomers to Canada. I mean, there are definitely more focus on with this government for Aboriginal inclusion, and working on that. There's some great resources created by it was called the Aboriginal Sports Circle, which was around coach modules for holistic learning, dealing with racism. So for coaches that are coaching in other communities that are Aboriginal and white mixed, in the community, or only first-time coaching Aboriginal athletes as well. Quite a bit of work on more at the participation level initially of newcomers to Canada, because often families would come and put their boys in soccer because they know that, but in their country, the culture wasn't for girls to be involved in sport, and how to educate that. Definitely, there's opportunities in Canadian culture. We are trying to get girls active as well, and and in all those pieces, those roles. So definitely, I mean, their numbers are low, I would say, in participation rates, but efforts are being made to, from different city parks and rec organizations, and partnering with the host organizations that are there when their newcomers come to Canada, to welcome them and such like that, and work with them and helping them, with language and getting jobs and those types of things. And we're trying to add the sport lens into it, because that's also a way to meet others in your community is through sports. If your kids are in sports, the parents are always on the sidelines, right? And it doesn't matter the backgrounds of the, if they all live in the same area, you could have different, social economic classes all on the sidelines, right? So who knows who'll give you your first job in Canada, right? But different ways to sell it to get parents willing to put their kids, into sports, and learning lots of stuff in that area. Because I think one of the first sessions I went to years ago around newcomers coming to Canada, and there were different groups there that do programming for girls, and they're talking about, the summer camp and the March break camp, and these holidays, like the holiday times when they run camps for kids, and they might have just come from a refugee camp. Why would the parents think they're going to put the kids back in camp? Because just the language we use, which is totally mainstream here, is like, oh my God, never thought of that. How just the kind of stuff that how we describe what's supposed to be a fun opportunity, but they've just escaped from one, right? So interesting, just all the nuances, and having definitely in all these situations, both working with like the Aboriginal Sports Circle and newcomer organizations, is spend more time asking questions and listening, rather than thinking like maybe we have the sport background and the gender lens, but it needs to be partnered with the organizations that, the populations you're trying to serve, right? So to understand, that the needs and the differences and what needs to be addressed. That kind of piece, it's long developing, the relationships, but I think definitely worth it. And also then training the young women to be the coaches of the younger ones, those type of things, having those opportunities for them to, get those skill sets. In Ontario, where I live, like the high school students have to do so many volunteer hours. So it can be in youth coaching, right? So they need to do it to graduate. So there's different opportunities where you can encourage them to do things that they're already passionate about, and it helps for their school credits.
Right. And then the question, it sounds like, is kind of maintaining that connection. So they're getting involved in school, and then they head off to college, and then kind of quote unquote life takes over. Right. And so creating persistence, it sounds like, is an issue for girls and then women in sport that's different perhaps for men. So boys and men perhaps persist more regularly in sport compared to women and girls. Is that what I'm understanding from what you had said before?
Well, I think there is like a lot of drop off after college for women's participation. There is, there's been some push. We've had resources previously around initiatives called Mothers in Motion. So, because oftentimes when women were having children, that was the time they were less active, right? And how can you actually continue their activity level and also be huge role models for their families, right? That if they're active, the kids will be active as well. But I think we've seen more of our sport associations also try to continue. Now with technology, I think it's a bit easier, but to keep alumni, like keep lists of alumni once you've been on a national team or a provincial team, so that you can keep in contact with these people. So down the road, when maybe their life has calmed down or they're settled in their job or the family or whatever, they can come back to their sport. Other playing it, there's lots more masters opportunities now for sure. But as well as in other volunteer roles, sometimes they come back, with their children as volunteering when their children are playing. But just not to lose touch with these people. And, for sure, you've got a wealth of knowledge in a lot of these, high performance athletes that could be helping your programs in lots of different ways.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about family and child, motherhood and stuff, and how we still, in North America at least, still exist. Well, actually, this is true for the United Kingdom too. where women are the primary caregivers, right? So it's women who tend to give up their job. It's women who take on that primary caregiving role. And so they, so the guy in a heterosexual relationship, the man continues in their work. The man continues perhaps to participate in sport in some way, but the woman takes on these additional roles. And so they're giving up these kind of like extra family activities and extra time. Yeah, like at higher rates, right? And that kind of, we take a step back, and that is connected to this socialization around womanhood, motherhood, and who should or should not be the primary caretaker, I think.
Definitely. It's interesting. This morning, I just read an article on at the World Curling Championships that were held in North Bay, Ontario, just a few weeks ago. The Canadian team that in the end won the event all had children there with them. And they were just talking about the idea, and they were, I would say, most of them were like under 5 or 6. And just the positive, their husbands were there. Some are also like high-level athletes, and some were professionals on the field, but they were having the child carrying duties along with the grandparents, but watching their moms compete at this high level, and which would not be normal in most sports, I would say. That, the women are probably, late 30s into 40s. But it was so positive to see on the ice after all these women had their children with them, which is, it was not something you see very often. Being in your own country, those kind of things, obviously opportunities easier to travel, and, than if it was somewhere else in the world, they probably wouldn't be there. But, for sure that we have not, some, for sure, there's lots of positive stories of the more balance of the caregiving and that type of thing. And, the term that, oh, my husband's babysitting. Well, no, he's just raising your own children. They're like, it's their duty too. It's not something like when you call an outsider to do the child care, babysitting. But we aren't, haven't cracked that yet. And it's interesting because it is a lot of, I know I'm hearing from lots of them, the personal struggle. They want to continue doing their sport, but they struggle, with being away from their children, or, if they're also working, and, that type of thing. But then at the same time, they're saying how, if they can, women, I think, are on so many levels are guilt driven, but the idea that, they're doing this so that they'll be healthier to take care of their children, and they'll enjoy their time, more with their children because they've had their release and their exercise and that type of thing. But yeah, it's definitely, our society hasn't totally figured that one out to have more equal balance on, raising children and that kind of stuff, and who gets opportunities to do things outside.
Right. Yeah. And I think that guilt driven thing is also like a huge socialization around, you're a bad mother if you don't dedicate 100% of your time to your children, right? Like, even though, I feel like that just still permeates, and that's a record that's playing in the background all the time. And so, and men are generally not faced with those same choices. And so it's, again, it's just the complexity of issues that are really affecting, obviously, young girls. The motherhood piece isn't affecting young girls, but as young girls become adults and want to have children or have a family, then we do start to see that how that has a profound effect on participation and leadership in sport, I think. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think I've seen some really good examples of university coaches that, they were a successful program. Maybe it wouldn't be the case if they weren't so successful, but that they actually did a wholesale change in when the practice times were for the athletes. They practiced, 2 to 4 or 1 to 3 instead of 5 to 7. So the women could be home after practice with their own children, right? And also having in some board meetings where, it was totally fine for, it was in all these cases, it was the woman, but the woman to bring her children, like when they're babies, to the meeting, and if they had a breastfeed or those type of things, or they had daycare. Like having those opportunities. Sometimes too, with some of we have a national games called the Canada Games. It's for youth, and it's winter and summer. Kind of mimics the idea of the Olympic Games. And female coaches that have had children have been given, ability to bring a caregiver. It could be their partner or their mother or whatever along, so that they can still coach the team and have the children with them. So they are getting, that's not across the board, but there's always a few each year that, more likely because the woman is picking the extra stress of doing it all, right? Because lots of times people, they just resign themselves like, this is just too much, but it's good that some are role modeling and are able to manage and are showing that it is possible, and also forcing the system to change, because I'm coming and I'm bringing my child and I need someone to take care of my child, so I need an extra accreditation or a hotel room, or maybe they're still paying for it, but they're at least they can do there. It's not a no. They find ways around it to actually make it happen.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's putting pressure points on the system so that the system buckles and changes, because so often the response from, when I say the system, I'm also thinking like kind of the leadership within the system as the mouthpiece of the system is like, no, we can't do that. And then the response really needs to be, well, why can't we do that? Right? Well, we've never done it before. Well, that doesn't mean we can't do it now. So having those conversations around like kind of calling into question the exclusionary and kind of ridiculousness of some of these practices and traditions, if you will, that it continue to exclude women in particular, right? Like there's not a legitimate reason other than these roles were created by and for men, right? So they weren't thinking about these other elements that are really relevant to women's lives.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, it is those pressure points. It is, the people we've talked about that are, have had, fighting for the injustices they've had put upon them. Like, you need that, because otherwise people, we can get away with this. We continue to treat women badly, and they just leave, right? It isn't everyone that in their career has the willingness or the potential, or will take on these battles. But having those things, hopefully there's some change that comes out of it, that that people realize, like, especially when you're like someone's hiring a coach, they're working for you. Like, you're supposed to be a team. You're not supposed to hire them and then treat them badly. Like what got missed in that? It isn't the enemy. This is who you've hired to work for you, to have success for you, right? So it isn't. It just sometimes it baffles me on how, like, it isn't the opposition you're treating badly. This is your own people. It's just those kind of things, as like, this doesn't make a lot of sense if you start thinking about it.
No, it doesn't. It really doesn't. And I think that kind of having those conversations and asking more pointed questions and kind of raising the nonsensical nature of some of these practices and processes, I think is really important for all of us to do, rather than just accept. I think we're apt to just accept, that's just the way it is, right? So I'm just going to leave. And so I know many women who have left environments rather than ask questions. And that's an individual choice. And I totally get it and respect, because every situation is different, right? And together, collectively, if we start to apply more pressure, I think that slowly things can change. And that's, certainly what you've done with your organization. And then hopefully with this influx of funding that you're getting from the Canadian government, it would allow that pressure to be firmer, stronger, and kind of more persistent, because you need resources, right? You can't just do this with air.
No, it's true. Yeah. That having that accountability, I think that is going to be if there's some policy change and accountability and monitoring. Like, for many years, I met with many different sport ministers and always said, okay, we either need a process with a reward for doing it, or, the carrot or the stick, or you get in trouble for not doing it. One or the other. If you do nothing, no one does anything. So I think we're definitely at a good point where there's, if this can be implemented, and there's education goes along, so like the sports will just learn a lot more on what they need to be doing. And if there's some money to do it, they can't, because usually the answer is we have no money. And often these issues, they're not all about money. It's attitudinal change. To bring a woman on board doesn't cost any more than bringing a man on the board. Maybe there's a few more phone calls to find them in the nominating process, but it's not usually so dollars that's the problem, right? It's attitude.
Yeah, it is attitude. So thinking about that and wrapping up this conversation, what solutions or advice can you offer some of our listeners around helping to change some of those attitudes? What can they do kind of on a small local level, or perhaps, for folks who are working at a more macro kind of community level? Do you have any advice for folks about what they can do?
Well, for sure, when we talked about this idea of asking questions, and don't take that this is the way we always done it as the a good enough answer. I mean, sometimes it's sharing best practices. If you've seen some other organization do something very, very well, bring that to your own organization. Show those examples of success. One of the other tools that was created at Cause is a gender equity self-assessment tool, and it can be found online. And it's for a community organization or a higher level or provincial, like state level or whatever organization, and it just has a framework for you in a non-threatening way, let's say around your board or your staff, whatever, to look at questions on type the quality of programming you're doing. What kind of policies do you have in place around gender equity? What are the leadership opportunities, in both staff, board, volunteers, and coaching? And what is your environment like on both the social and the physical? And and then it gives you a score. Like the answers are never thought about it. We do this, we need more improvement in this area. So then you can kind of look at your assessment of your own organization that you're working with. And then there's a starting point to see, what changes could be made. We've actually had organizations, they fill it in, and it's not the idea, it wasn't to send them in to us, it was for themselves. But, they were so proud that they were been doing things right. You don't get the bad ones, you only get the good ones, right? But that type of thing, just because you need conversation starters, around this. Yes, sometimes it's fights that actually make change, but sometimes it's the cooler heads talking about it, that actually, it's not, you're not feeling so defensive, if you having those kind of starting points for discussion. So we've seen that be a positive, conversation starter. And now if there's actually going to be, some support, often I find too for women, having these conversations about these issues, don't always solve them, but you don't feel so alone, right? Often it's isolation, right? So networking, women's organizations, opportunities to have discussions like around these issues. You kind of get power in numbers, even if you're not in the same organization, but realize you're not the only one fighting the battle. Sometimes it gives you the strength, to continue to challenge, the systems that we need to make change in.
Yeah, that's huge, I think, feeling that you're not alone, because sometimes it can feel like you're an island, but there are multiple people and, pushing for a change. And so connecting with those folks, I think, is really a critical piece of all this. What about for down on the local level for families who maybe have young children who are participating in sports? Is there anything that they can do kind of to set the scene and to shift some of those perceptions really early on?
Sure. I mean, I think, it's some stuff is really basic for parents. I mean, it's going to watch your kids. It's celebrating their successes. I mean, we joke about putting the girls' sport picture on the fridge, just like you have the boys' hockey card, or the baseball card. Like having things that recognize, or it could be in gymnastics, it could be whatever sport they're doing, but having that interest in it, and bringing the whole family to it. So the girls' sports is just as valuable, as the boys' sports. Sometimes it's bringing your daughters to the next level. So they're in high school, do you bring them to a university game? Is there opportunities for to see where the path is? Because often, if they don't know that they could, that older girls who they think are, the cool factor or whatever, if they see them doing it, oh, okay, there is a place for me to go. I can continue in this role. Definitely. I mean, I've seen, it's that, having fathers taking as much interest in the girls' sports as their sons' sports, those types of things. Sometimes it's, the mom coming out playing, the practicing the sport or the dad, either case. But we see the role modeling is stronger between the mother and daughter. If the mother is active, more chance that the daughter will be active. There's still the male piece also helps, but for sure, stronger correlation if the mom is active that the girls will be active. So role modeling and those type of thing, having sport be something you do as a family, and not saying, oh, the girls can't do this. Well, the boys are going to do this and the girls are going to do something, supposedly less risky or whatever. But having everyone have the opportunities, and for sure at the younger ages, having the girls opportunity for skill development, because we know sometimes that is the area that keeps girls out of wanting to participate because they don't feel they have the the necessary skills and the confidence to do it. So having the chance to build young women's skills, and never, saying that they can't do something that their, the male colleague, their male siblings are doing, is positive piece for families.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some really great concrete tips there that I think a lot of this kind of exclusion or limiting happens unconsciously. I don't think a lot of folks think about it. But there are perhaps long-term consequences of kind of not honoring girls' participation and activity in sport in the same way that you might honor a boy's. So that's a really important tip. Well, thank you so much, Karen, for sharing your perspective today. It's been really great talking with you. You have such a wealth of knowledge from the work that you've been doing over the last 30 years. And I think that our listeners have likely learned a lot, and you've given us a lot to think about.
Great. Happy to share.
Thanks again to Karen for joining us today and for sharing her perspectives on the persistent barriers facing women and girls in sport and the work she has done over the years to eradicate those barriers in Canada and internationally. For show notes, including related links and a full transcript of the episode, please visit wispsports.com. You can also find hundreds of additional podcasts on Wisp Sports Radio. Subscribe to us using your preferred podcast player, and don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes. For more conversations from the world of women's sport, including blogs, articles, and videos, visit wispsports.com. Post your comments, questions, and suggestions on our Facebook page or email us at info@wispsports.com and follow, share, and like @wispsports on social media. You can reach me, Lisa Ingarfield, directly at Try to Defy, that's TRITODEFI, on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you for listening and supporting women in sport everywhere. We'll be back next month with another in-depth, thought-provoking conversation.